Imagine a country already consumed by a total war, where every newspaper screamed of distant battles, patriotic fervor, and the fight to make the world safe for democracy. Now imagine that same country blindsided by an enemy far more lethal than any bullet or bomb, an invisible, airborne predator that, in a single year, would kill more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined. This is the meticulously researched, horrifying, and ultimately inspiring true story of the 1918 influenza pandemic, not as a chapter in a medical textbook, but as a visceral collapse of the American home front. It is the story of soldiers dying in barracks before they could ship out, of city councils ordering mass graves, of doctors realizing their science was useless, and of the forgotten American heroes who stepped into the abyss of mass death while the rest of the world looked the other way. The war was overseas, but the true fight for survival took place on Main Street, USA. Part 1. The Perfect Storm, the American Spring of 1918. The year was 1918, and America was roaring. A fierce wind of patriotism and purpose whipped across the nation, driven by the drumbeat of the Great War. President Woodrow Wilson had galvanized the populace, declaring that the U.S. had entered the conflict to end all conflicts. Men were volunteering in droves, Liberty bonds were being sold like hotcakes, and every factory, farm, and home was mobilized for the war effort. The sole focus of the American government and its people was victory in Europe. Nothing mattered. The great machine of American mobilization ground on relentlessly, fueled by a dizzying sense of national destiny. At the heart of this machine were the military training camps, vast, hurriedly constructed cities of canvas and wood designed to transform farm boys and city clerks into soldiers ready to face the Kaiser's army. Places like Camp Funston in Kansas, a massive complex housing 56,000 troops, were crucibles of American power and determination. But they were also perfect petri dishes. The whiff of something wrong in Kansas. The first sign of the true enemy did not arrive with a roar, but with a cough. It was March 18 in Funston, Kansas. A cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary with flu-like symptoms, a high fever, sore throat, and severe headache. Within hours, dozens of soldiers from the mess hall followed. Within a week, 1,100 men were in the hospital, and another 3,800 were too sick for duty. This was more than just a bad cold. It was a strange, aggressive infection that knocked the strongest men flat. Yet this was the spring wave, the first relatively mild phase of what would become the deadliest pandemic in modern history. The sick recovered, and only a few died. Doctors, steeped in then-current theories of bacteriology, dismissed it as severe but familiar influenza, perhaps complicated by the close quarters of camp life. The nation's eyes were fixed on the trenches of France. A little sickness in Kansas was a mere footnote. The government, terrified of undermining troop morale in the war machine, downplayed the reports, often censoring any mention of widespread illness. In the press, the flu was quickly dubbed the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, it almost certainly did not, but because Spain, which was neutral in the war, was one of the few countries whose newspapers were free from wartime censorship. Spanish papers could honestly report on the severity of the outbreak, thus giving the false impression that the pandemic was centered there. America and the Allied nations were content to let the neutral country take the blame, maintaining the illusion of a healthy, robust fighting force. A lethal export. By April and May, as American troop ships, packed tight with young, eager soldiers, began their treacherous journeys across the Atlantic, they carried an unseen, lethal cargo. The troop transports became floating incubators. Sick soldiers infected healthy soldiers. The virus mingled and mutated, adapting to its new crowded host environment. The sheer speed of the U.S. mobilization, necessary for the war, was inadvertently serving as a global distribution system for the plague. The first American Expeditionary Forces, or AEFs, to arrive in France brought the virus to the European battlefields, infecting both Allied and German troops, blurring the lines between the front and the fever ward. The focus remained entirely on the Kaiser. The little sickness that had started in Kansas was now a global phenomenon, but it was just warming up. The great silence surrounding the flu was perhaps the most astonishing policy of the time. Surgeon General Rupert Blue and other public health officials deliberately chose to mislead the public, adhering to the sentiment, "A cheerful attitude is necessary to win the war." If the public knew how many soldiers were sick or dying on U.S. soil, before even seeing combat, panic might ensue and the war effort would suffer. This decision to prioritize morale over medical truth was the ultimate setup for the devastating blow to come. By late summer, the virus, having spread across continents and through millions of human hosts, had undergone a catastrophic genetic shift. The relatively mild spring flu was evolving into something monstrous, a predator specifically targeting the young and the strong. The U.S. was about to reap the harvest of its silence, and the ground zero for the first American tragedy would be a massive military camp just north of Boston. The invisible enemy was coming home, and it was no longer mild. It was pure, unadulterated death.